I'm so glad to have back on Bad Faith podcast at a really important moment. Alec Karakatsanis, you know him as a civil rights lawyer, co-founder of Equal Justice Under Law and executive director of Civil Rights Corps. He's also the author of Usual Cruelty and a new book called Propaganda. Welcome back to the show, Alec.
Great to be here, Brie.
All right, so I wanted you here for two reasons. One is that you just wrote a really important paper. Some people might have consumed it as a Twitter thread that I think really threw me for a loop and probably a lot of other readers for a loop because it undermines, I think, what have become really settled expectations and understandings around the value of police cameras. And pointedly, you make the argument that there had been a movement, a campaign to increase funding to the police specifically for the purposes of making police cameras, basically body cams, ubiquitous, not for the purpose of preventing crimes against low-income communities, people of color, police violence, generally speaking, against the community, but to expand surveillance and make it easier to convict people who are disproportionately low income. What is the argument?
So I was really shocked myself when I set about on the task of kind of trying to understand the public narrative around body cameras since the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. And when I started reading hundreds and hundreds of articles over the last decade, I noticed something really fascinating, which is that the actual story of the police body camera has been completely, to use George Orwell's term, put in the memory hole. It's been completely erased from the public consciousness. And so I thought using the statements from the industry itself, from police leaders, from prosecutors, to try to reconstruct what actually happened with police body cameras so that we can see kind of how it came to be, in my view, one of the most important contemporary examples of what I call the big deception. And that big deception is the way in which people in power hide their true intentions and the true functions of the systems that they're building from ordinary people who just want a world that is safer, more equal, more just, where people can flourish. And so for those people who want something like, fewer police killings of poor people and Black people and marginalized people in our society, the body camera was an easy sell, right? But the body camera actually increases police violence and reduces police accountability. And you can see that every year since the killing of George Floyd, for example, where there's been hundreds of millions of dollars more invested in police body cameras, the police have killed more people than the year before. So I set about trying to understand this. So what it turns out is prior to the 2014 killing of Michael Brown, the multi-billion-dollar police surveillance industry had this new product that they wanted to sell. And not just the body camera itself. Most people misunderstand that the camera itself is actually not where all the money is to be made. Most of the money is to be made from the perpetual software and AI and algorithmic contracts for servicing and training and software updates, et cetera, as well as the big data storage and big data processing of all the new data that is collected through hundreds of thousands of police officers filming millions of interactions with the public. That's a lot of data. And what it requires when you have a body camera program as a police department is like a perpetual contract with companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Axon, to understand and process and exploit that information. So, and then of course, there's lots of money to be made from various forms of selling that information to other people and companies. So these people had this idea. They saw it as a multi-billion-dollar industry opportunity. And they first went about selling it to police departments. And they very quickly got police chiefs and prosecutors and others very excited about this possibility. They all envisioned this future of sort of total surveillance, where every police officer in the country could be outfitted with a mobile surveillance camera that the cops themselves control. That's a key part of this, right? The body camera is an outward-looking video that the police control that does not film what the cops are doing. So, for example, the iconic images of the police killing of Eric Garner or George Floyd, right? These were filmed by by bystanders. And as James Baldwin has, so beautifully written, the language of the camera is the language of our dreams. And that's sort of the subtitle of my piece, because whoever is in control of the camera determines what is filmed, when it's filmed, how it's then edited, and then when, critically, it's released to the public. So you have a situation like the police murder of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, which was hidden from the public for the entire mayoral race and election, right? Only finally released to the public after Rahm Emanuel had won re-election, and only because of a court order then, right? So police are in control. So they wanted this technology. The other thing that's is really important to understand is the police wanted to link all their new surveillance footage with new algorithmic biometric stuff like facial recognition software, voice recognition software. So for example, police wanted a tool where they could go to a protest and just scan the crowd and then know all the faces that were in, and then match those faces. And that provides them the ability not just to know who's in a protest, but who is next to whom, who knows each other, who might be organizing and leading the protest. Really sophisticated stuff that the AI can do with this. So the police wanted this. Now, prosecutors also wanted it for sort of slightly separate reasons. Prosecutors understand very clearly that the criminal punishment system in the US, the vast majority of it is low-level cases against very poor people. So, the vast bulk, the most common charge in the US, possession of marijuana, possession of drug paraphernalia, trespassing, things like that. The entire criminal system relies on this. Only 4% of all police time is devoted to violent crime. And only 5% of all police arrests are for what the FBI and the police call serious violent crime. So the rest of it is low-level stuff. And that stuff can be really hard to sort of prove. And if people assert their rights to have a lawyer and a trial, it would completely destroy the system. The system needs, in order to process so many people and get them to plead guilty and get them to owe fines and debt in this tens of billions of dollars of debt that the system relies on, in order to get that to happen, it'd be very beneficial for the prosecutors to have video evidence that the police control. And police and prosecutors knew early on that because they control the video and they control when it's public, they can mostly use the cameras to film the things that they want to film and to not film the things that they don't want to film and to not release those things. And this is also an important component of it, but you've noticed probably that when the police want a body camera film released to the public, it's released right away. They put it into the sort of virality. They can make videos go viral, when it's some undocumented migrant, alleged to be in a fight with police and they want to stoke this right-wing narrative. They can get that into the viral social media channels right away. But when it's the killing and murder of an unarmed Black woman on video, it could take months or years to get that released. And in our current culture, virality is everything. Whether a clip is seen by 200 million people or 200,000 people makes a huge difference to what the public cares about. And the body camera allows police to control that. So I studied all of that and I looked at their own statements, and it was really funny, the things that we learned, So my research assistants and I uncovered that in the early years before Michael Brown was killed, the police became so desperate for body cameras, and they couldn't get local governments and the state governments and the national government to actually give them the cash for them, that they started going to private donors like Steven Spielberg and other people who were actually paying the police through various police foundations to have body cameras because they wanted them so badly.
Wait, what kind of pitch works on what's Steven Spielberg's investment in it? Because post the Black Lives Matter movement, post 2014, there was what seemed like messaging driven by abolitionists, social justice activists, that there was an accountability link to the camera. Is that a pitch that the actual police were making to people like independent donors like Steven Spielberg, or were people like Spielberg actually invested in, quote unquote, bringing down crime rates or having higher conviction rates, et cetera, because of body cams?
That's a great question. I can't speak to what specifically persuaded Spielberg, but I can say what the police themselves were telling people. So in the early pre-Michael Brown, in the early years, police were pitching the camera as a law enforcement tool. I use the term law enforcement in quotes at all times because police are only enforcing some laws against some people some of the time. They're not enforcing hardly any criminal laws against wealthier people or people in power or the police themselves. So it's really important to understand that law enforcement is a term of propaganda. I think a better term.
The CFO secretary doesn't have a body cam on her blouse.
That's right.
Or
right.
his blouse.
There were no body cameras in the boardroom at Enron. So I think what they were telling people at the time was that this will protect police officers because we control this video. It'll protect us from liability. It'll enable us to prosecute more people. And indeed, for many, many years, the body cameras are used almost exclusively to prosecute poor people in low-level offenses and almost never used against the police. I'm not saying it has never happened. The exception sometimes proves the rule, right? It can be a very useful thing sometimes for them every once in a blue moon to have a video that shows the police, some of the videos in the Baltimore gun squad corruption cases, the police were so incompetent that they caught themselves on their own body cameras planting evidence, right? So sometimes that kind of stuff does happen, but that's not that we're talking about a 1 in a million kind of situation, right? The main function of the cameras is surveillance and, mass processing of guilty pleas. So that was making billions of dollars. The value of the main body camera company went up by billions of dollars in the years right after Michael Brown was killed. There's also something important to understand as a background feature. And then I think the most important thing to talk about is the propaganda effects. But one key early point is there's some amazing economists at Duke University led by a professor named Bokhar Ba, who have studied the financial markets. And they've shown that the stock prices and the valuation of companies in the policing and surveillance industry go up after the killings of unarmed Black people. And this is a really important fact. The market understands that police violence is actually beneficial for this industry. Because in the wake of police violence, what happens? All these politicians come in and they say, well, we need to spend more money on more technology and training to make the police better. And this is a huge boon for all these surveillance companies like the body camera companies.
I am curious then what the attitude is sort of now of police officers individually toward these body cameras, because I can definitely see the argument for why prosecutors find it valuable, why the owners of these surveillance companies find it to be valuable, and why even on a systemic level, the police force that is able to use body cam footage to coerce guilty pleas and raise conviction rates find it to be valuable. But even if it is relatively rare on an individual level, there is some risk presented to the individual officer for being caught doing crimes themselves. And I think front of mind for a lot of people is going to be this recent body cam footage showing Sonya Massey being shot almost point blank in her own home.
We don't need a fire while we're here.
Right.
It all went wrong in under 30 seconds, from the moment when Sonya Massey walked over to her kitchen stove until she lay dying on the floor, shot in the face by Sangamon County Sheriff's Deputy Sean Grayson.
Where you going?
Away from your hot steaming water.
Away from my hot steaming water?
Yeah.
Oh, I would rebuke you in the name of Jesus. I rebuke you in the name of Jesus.
Better. I swear to God, I'll shoot you right in your face.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Drop the pot. Drop the pot. Drop.
The deadly shooting took place in Springfield on July 6th, when two sheriff's deputies responded to a 911 call made by Massey herself, who believed there was a prowler in the area. Body cam video shows the deputies searching the neighborhood before knocking on her door, then waiting for several minutes until she opened up for them. Massey initially seems confused, unable to clearly express what she needed.
Please God, I'm trying to get help, y'all, but
What do you need help with?
nothing. Please God, please, I don't know what to do.
In the aftermath of the shooting, Sheriff's Deputy Sean Grayson tells responding officers Massey came after him. But at least in the video from his own body-worn camera, that does not appear to be the case.
You shot her? Yeah.
She was given an instruction to get up. She called the police to her home in the first place. She was given an instruction to go over to her stove and take a pot of boiling water off of the fire. And as she's doing so, seemingly out of nowhere, she is shot by a cop who immediately makes the case to the other police officer in the room and then later to other police when he goes outside of her home that she was a crazy bitch. He was about to throw boiling water on him. The video shows nothing of the sort. So given that background, given that there are these, as you say, kind of 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million cases, are cops still on an individual level supportive, wanting to wear these body cams?
I can't speak to what individual cops think, and I'm sure there's actually a range of, like any issue, you can find somebody who believes almost anything. I can't speak to what every individual cop thinks, but I've only studied the views and statements of police leaders. And police leaders love body cameras, as do prosecutors. Individual cops, I would imagine, have slightly different and more complex views because the policing bureaucracy is its own kind of, labor management situation. And it is true that a lot of the leading body camera makers market their technology to police leaders as a way to control and monitor individual line cops. And so it's possible that some individual line cops resent the camera technology as a method of surveilling themselves. Now, of course, police leaders aren't using that to meaningfully make the police bureaucracy more violent. They're using it to do other kinds of tracking and monitoring that they can then use for their various big data policing algorithms and stuff like that, and to see like which cops are doing what on their shift. So I don't really know what individual line cops think necessarily, although I've talked to some and anecdotally, have heard that most of them like the body cameras now, because they think that it gives them more control over and helps them build the evidence against the mostly poor people that they're arresting for low-level crimes.
Can you speak a little bit more to that control? Because I do think that's a compelling point. The way that police officers, because they are wearing the body cameras and because they can create a sort of verbal narrative structure around the recording, are able to use it to provide evidence, contemporaneous evidence for their kind of state of mind, et cetera, knowing that they're wearing the camera, even if it's untrue. And we saw this a little bit in the Massey video as well, where the police officer immediately starts saying she was threatening me, she was going to throw the water. Now, the video is clear enough, but you can imagine other scenarios where people are running, there's jostling, people are off camera for a moment and then back on, where those kind of contemporaneous statements might seem like they support the cop's case, despite the video evidence.
This is a really important point. Let me preface my answer by making a very high-level point I should have made earlier. There is enormous research on this from the federal government itself that shows that police body cameras do not make police less violent. They do not affect police corruption, and they do not affect police violence. So that was the whole point of the liberal embrace of body cameras is to, because it was seen as some kind of solution, or at least it was marketed. I don't think people actually saw it this way, but which I can get to later. It was marketed as a solution for police violence. The studies show it does not have that effect. So that's a really important thing. And one of the reasons, among many, is this thing you're talking about, which is police have been trained to say things so that the audio on the camera picks them up that sow doubt and confusion in the minds of people who later read them. One of the most common things we see when we analyze body camera footage in court in low-level cases is, so first of all, most body camera footage is very boring. It does not capture anything violent, any resisting by a person. It's literally just footage of the police interviewing someone and getting them without a lawyer to admit to, sleeping on property that's not theirs, or it shows them possessing some kind of drug paraphernalia device. I mean, that's the standard body camera, right? The cases where it shows some kind of altercation or scuffle, the police are trained from off camera to say things like stop resisting, stop resisting, stop resisting. And merely by saying that, they're able to create some sense later for people who are viewing it that, well, they can't really see what's happening with the cop because the cop is behind the camera, but that something must be happening that's leading the police officer to say stop resisting. And so anything that the police do, and that's why in the killing of Tyree Nichols, for example, in Memphis, it wasn't the police body camera that was the most damning footage. It was footage from a poll that captured what all the cops were doing in the murder of Tyree Nichols. And that's really vital to have that other because you can see from the other perspective that there is no meaningful resistance, right? But when the cop is on him, and by the way, the camera is affixed to the cop's chest, which there's a reason that when you watch movies, the directors are not filming with something attached to their chest, because it creates the sense that everything is moving and shaking, and it creates this sense of danger and urgency, much more than like if you're actually just holding something still, right, with your hands. And so when the police are saying stop resisting and they're moving like this, it gives the impression that there's this kind of chaotic situation that they can't respond to. When in fact, it's a very misleading, as Baldwin said, the language of our dreams. It's a very misleading perspective to be filming from.
I see. And I'm also curious though, it wasn't just the argument as I have interpreted it wasn't just about body cameras making police less violent, but also about the idea that it would lead to more accountability. So I do think this Massey case is interesting because I fully accept that it might be a very, very rare occasion where, one, you're dealing with this kind of violence in the first place, this level of violence as opposed to the lower level crimes, and two, where the video evidence, where the body cam evidence is so completely clear. And even to the point where some people have noted that when the officer, Sean Grayson, leaves the house and other cops have been called and they're all standing outside looking at him, it almost feels like there's a pall across the group, like of silence, because even, maybe this is just projection, obviously, but even they can't believe he would shoot this woman in cold blood in the head in her own kitchen in this way. But it does seem like, but for that video, given how quickly, how immediately he starts talking about how he was threatened by a quote unquote crazy bitch with a large pot of boiling water, that would have been the accepted narrative, but for the body camera. So, I mean, how should people kind of interpret, I think, the really important findings of your paper in light of this news event that happens to have come out just, a week or so later?
A really important thing to understand is that the policing bureaucracy wants us to be focused on the bad apple cops. It actually embraces the body camera because it enables us to punish every now and then individual bad actor cops for horrible things that they do. So it enables the public to focus attention, like this body cam video, rightly is stoking a lot of outrage, right? And one of the reasons they were able to, and they decided to use Michael Brown's killing because there was no body camera footage. That was the key, right? Prior to Michael Brown, they couldn't get billions of dollars. After Michael Brown, immediately the money started flowing because Democratic politicians and others started saying, oh, there was no video of Michael Brown's killing. We want that kind of accountability in those cases. So we need to get every cop in the country. Let's spend billions of dollars. They saw it as a boon. But something you have to remember is what we actually care about is how many people are being killed by the police. And what we actually care about is not just police killings, but all of the other everyday violence. Questions like, why are armed government agents at this woman's house in the first place? Why are armed government agents in Ferguson, for example, which when Michael Brown was killed, averaged 3.6 arrest warrants for every household, almost all of which for unpaid debt. These are deeper questions like, why is it that almost all of the police interactions in our society are with poor people of color disproportionately? Why are they about low-level cases? Why are they about debt collection? These are deeper questions about the function of policing in our society. And what the body camera does is it enables the police to say, let's not talk about most of what we do. But let's focus our attention right here on this cop who killed George Floyd and this cop, who shot an unarmed woman in the face in her own apartment. So I think I go into this in a lot more detail in the article, but it's very similar to, and I make this analogy to international development. So the best and most important propagandistic interventions are ones that do have some side benefits to them. So for example, like, it's not all bad to give out cash payments to people in some country in the global south that the US has destroyed through various of its policies. That's great. It helps some people in this, but when you create an entire international bureaucracy around giving a few crumbs to places that have been utterly and systemically destroyed and whose resources you are still extracting, right? It enables you to create this whole artifice that, like, oh, the international community cares about the people in this country because we give them aid, when in fact, it's all distracting us from the underlying, like, systemic causes of why that aid is needed. And the same thing is true, a very similar phenomenon is happening in the criminal punishment system. The body camera has turned out to be an incredibly effective tool of propaganda, because after every new police killing, instead of asking deeper questions like, why is the US spending so much more money than every other country in the modern world on armed government bureaucrats, policing, prosecution, prisons, cages, etc., and we have a more violent society, right? It's actually not making our society less violent. Why are the police in this neighborhood and not that neighborhood? Why are there cops patrolling Michael Brown's neighborhood, but not the sort of all-white frat houses where there's rampant sexual assault and drug use? Just to give, one commonly used example. Why are the police in schools with poor children where a fight turns into a criminal record, whereas a fight in a wealthy private school maybe gets a call to the parents and, sitting out recess for a couple of days? So, like, these are the fundamental questions, and I'm being a little bit crude here, and the article goes through in much more detail with citations and examples, and but body cameras have turned into an incredible tool of distraction that have enabled the very institutions that keep being more and more violent to use their own violence to get more money in a way that does not make them less violent. So I understand the impulse. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead, please. You understand the impulse.
I understand the impulse to say we wouldn't have a video of the murder of this woman in her own apartment if the cop wasn't wearing a body camera. But I think the deeper question is, why would we promote something as a reform that doesn't lead to fewer killings of unarmed Black people? If that's if the ultimate goal is that.
I really hear you. I mean, my kind of follow-up question was going to be, well, how did we let ourselves get so hoodwinked? But you kind of did just explain it, because there was something very compelling about the idea, well, at least this woman's family has the means for accountability. And I can feel myself being pulled that way. I am a little more curious how more, seasoned social justice activists and criminal justice experts manage to be so derailed by the body cam narrative. But it's almost a bigger question than that. It's a bigger question because it's how did the entire movement manage to get so frankly silenced after what felt like what was a historic resurgence of interest in criminal justice issues that culminated in the 2020 protests. And I think part of that is looking at the response, frankly, to Massey. I mean, to your point, Kamala Harris posted a tweet saying Sonya Massey deserved to be safe. The disturbing footage released yesterday confirms what we know from the lived experiences of so many. We have much work to do to ensure that our justice system fully lives up to its name. President Biden and I call on Congress to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, a bill that I co-authored in the Senate. We must come together to achieve meaningful reforms that advance the safety of all communities. So I'm hearing some buzzwords. Reforms, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which I've seen people argue would not have prevented this at all. I see you shaking your head, so I'd love to hear more about that. And then the focus on the footage. The footage is what gets the response from our political leadership, not the more systemic issues that you point to. So I'd love to get you to respond to Kamala's response, and maybe also speak to this question of how did we get here after this moment in 2020 and starting in 2014, where there seemed to be so much potential for more substantive change as opposed to just reform.
One of the key aspects of my article is that there has been a complete rewriting of this history. Even in 2014, and especially in 2020, most of the people that I work with, the experts in the field, were extremely opposed to body cameras. We understood what was going to happen and what was going on, because virtually every major reform to the criminal punishment system over the last 40 or 50 years has had disastrous consequences, has only strengthened that system. For example, probation and parole were once a reform. They are now the leading driver of incarceration in the United States. It's really, really important to understand that there were a lot of people led by Black people and directly impacted people. A lot of them, one of the intellectual leaders of that movement, Mariam Kaba, was extremely clear, from those early days that things like body cameras were not going to be a solution. Those voices were systematically and surgically excluded from every single news article that I reviewed in the post-2014 period. If you go look at all these articles, which I did with my research assistants, there is no mention in any of them that there were civil rights and prominent experts who raised these questions and opposed body cameras for these reasons, and that the police themselves wanted body cameras. The whole narrative after 2014 was body cameras are genuinely in good faith being proposed as a tool of accountability and transparency. That was not the origin story of body cameras at all. They were not proposed to make police less violent and to bring accountability. That was not why the companies saw them as a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. That narrative has been completely and utterly erased, to the point where a lot of people think that criminal justice advocates themselves were asking for body cameras. Not true. Now, in every field, there are reformists who play a very important role for the institutions of power. They are people who get co-opted they're the people who come from marginalized groups who you see standing next to a politician when they sign a bill, right? The reason they do that is it's a propaganda tool, right? If you signed a civil rights bill surrounded only by white people, for example, or it would look different than if you signed a civil rights bill surrounded by people of all different, ethnicities and races, et cetera. Like, optics in these things matter.
I'm thinking of the famous picture of, I forget which kind of Democrat signed some, free lunch for kids bill, and all the kids are looking very happy and hugging him. And then there's a juxtaposition of a picture of Donald Trump signing one of these child labor bills, and the kids are wearing suits and standing very stiffly next to him, like a little 7-year-old in a little suit and tie Brooks Brothers outfit, meant to demonstrate exactly that sort of thing, the hypocrisy of the underlying program, or the cruelty of the underlying program to the people it's supposed to quote unquote benefit. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And no, I mean, what I write about in the articles is very interesting. People like Mariam Kaba were not being quoted in the New York Times and NPR and NBC News, all these body camera articles. Who was being quoted? Very particular professors and very particular employees of nonprofits who were being chosen precisely because they were pro-body camera. And it would have been, here's the point to understand about propaganda. If all these articles contained quotes from police leaders and the companies that are making billions of dollars off of it, and all those people were saying, oh, this is a win-win situation, it's going to be so good for people, the public might have been more skeptical. But precisely because the people that were handpicked to be quoted in these articles were, an NYU professor who purports to be interested in police reform, and an employee of the ACLU who's saying body cameras are a win-win for everyone, the reader is implicitly being, and sometimes explicitly being given the message that, oh, the experts who care about surveillance and privacy, and the experts who study these things, they all think body cameras are a win-win for everyone. And they erased all of the voices of Black people, poor people, people with disabilities, and criminal justice experts who were sounding the alarm and who were saying, if you care about police violence, what you should be doing is investing in these communities, in early childhood education, mental health care, other forms of cash assistance, housing, the various things that we know from all of the empirical research actually reduce police violence and reduce violence generally. But those are deep investments in the structural systems of our society. And the powers that be don't want the conversation to be about that. And so we're distracting. And so we're having all these conversations about police violence, and we're promoting solutions that not only won't decrease police violence, but will actually increase the power of police. That's what the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is so harmful. Nothing in that act is a significant intervention that will reduce police violence. It is a tool of propaganda.
So what does and doesn't it do? Because my recollection was that there was discourse around it being largely ineffective, but also that Biden had set for himself a deadline of passing it by the year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. That would have been in the spring of 2021, early into his term. It didn't happen. And I remember the only real observation or accountability for him failing to pass it, as toothless as it is, was, I believe, a sort of a tweet from Al Sharpton saying, well, we'd rather it be perfect than get passed quickly. And so we're going to get back to it. And now here we are in 2024, over 3 years later, with Kamala Harris now trotting it back out as a response to this violent on-camera assassination. In the middle of a discourse about whether or not she is a good new nominee for the Democratic Party because of all of the criticism she got back during her presidential run in 2019, 2020 over being the quote unquote top cop of California. So I'd love for you to speak to, why we shouldn't hang our hopes on the George Floyd Justice and Policing bill, and in fact, what in it might be detrimental. And then I'd love to broaden the conversation up into talking about how finally police reform, more than reform, is back in the news, but largely in the context of a conversation about whether or not criticisms of Kamala Harris were overblown back in the day.
So it's quite complicated, and I don't purport to be an expert in the politics of sort of all the backroom dealing that went on. My understanding is that one of the provisions of the act was targeting qualified immunity, which is a civil legal doctrine. For a variety of reasons, I actually don't think eliminating qualified immunity would have an impact on police violence, although it might make it easier for lawyers to bring cases on behalf of people who've been harmed by police. But for a variety of reasons, even when police are sued and don't get qualified immunity because their actions were so egregious, it's not usually the cop that pays the money. The cops are indemnified by the cities. That's why cities like Chicago and New York are spending billions of dollars every decade on police settlement money. It's either insurance companies or municipalities. Individual cops don't really face consequences from these like civil lawsuits. So the civil legal standard in those cases. But my understanding is that opposition from more conservative Democrats and Republicans derailed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act because it had a provision about qualified immunity. It also does some other things that relate to transfer of military weaponry from, and it's been a few years since I actually looked at the act. But it was also calling for more accountability through body cameras and investments in that, et cetera. So it was all like little things that actually don't address the major, in contrast, and it's a little bit confusing because it's actually really hard to find media coverage that actually tells you what's in the act. You have to go to the actual language of the bill and read the complicated stuff to actually see what it's doing, because the propaganda from Democrats is so vague about what they're trying to do with the act. But it was happening at the same time as other more substantial pieces of legislation that are being proposed by people like Cori Bush, like the People's Response Act. Those kinds of interventions, in contrast to the Justice and Policing Act, which is much more, stuff around the edges that actually doesn't really affect anything, and bad stuff like body camera stuff. The People's Response Act would actually invest in this kind of systems of care that communities need, like mental health care, et cetera. So the difference between like things that might actually help some of these problems and things that just are being done so that Democrats can say, "Oh, we proposed this thing." Meanwhile, I think they all understood that it had a very long shot of passing if it included anything major, and so that's why it never included anything major in it, because there never was the political will to substantially reduce police violence. But the difference between these things is, like, I would say two major factors. One is a reform will be good and helpful if it reduces the size and power and profit of the policing industry, right? And a reform might be good if it builds alternate systems of care that we can then grow and build and pilot, that communities can control, that actually help them get the things that they need. And so the People's Response Act, which I encourage people to take a look at, is all about actually shifting investments and federal money away from things like police body cameras and other forms of technology and training. And by the way, the police training industry is very similar to this. It's a absolute catastrophe of far right, violent, extremist ideology. So whenever you hear someone saying we need police to get more training, that person is either wants to make the police more violent or has no idea what the police training industry looks like.
Yeah, I mean, in a post-Cop City world, that does seem genuinely irresponsible, especially now that so many more Americans have had direct encounters with the police and what that training really means, the relationship with being trained by Israel and all what that really means, because they're directly encountering them on these campus protests in a very similar, at least ideological position that Palestinians themselves are confronting as they advocate for their rights in Gaza. And this comes back to the point you were making earlier about the pure surveillance potential. How much of the discourse did we see from the right about how these protesters must be quote unquote guilty because they were obstructing their faces with either COVID masks or kifyas? But to your point, it seems like a really smart idea given how the body cams are being used as a surveillance tool to enact punishments kind of outside of the legal system and within the legal system against this population.
I get into this in the article, but a lot of that is based on, a lot of this is just a rehashing of colonial counterinsurgency strategy that was developed by the French and British and then sort of used by the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. But one of the key things in the Army Field Manual, for example, when soldiers are trained in how to disrupt and prevent and block protest and resistance by native populations, is they actually talk about the importance of filming the protesters as a deterrent, as a way of letting native people understand that if you're going to come out here, we're going to document who you are and who you're with. And we're going to have records of all of this so that we can infiltrate. And so the idea is that people behave better, i.e. they don't protest injustice, if they know they're on film. So that's one of the key, a lot of the military counterinsurgency techniques from the French in Algeria and Vietnam and the British in a number of different places, and the US has been imported into US policing under the term community policing. So if you ever hear the term community policing, that's actually what it actually means, is counterinsurgency operations. It's a way of pacifying the local native population. So you see, for example, the Atlanta Police Department hosting midnight basketball games for children. That's directly taken from colonial era attempts to funnel money through the police so the police can use it for their own marketing and relationship building to develop informants and cultivate sort of goodwill among certain segments of the population. It's more complicated than this, obviously, and you can read more about it in my article, but also great work that people like Orasanmi Burton have done, Stuart Schrader. There's a lot of great scholarship on the history of this. But I think the main point for our present purposes is that a lot of what we see with crowd control in current domestic U.S. protest is directly taken from a consulting industry and a sort of military industrial complex that learned all of this stuff in Israel, in the French colonies, in the British colonies, and I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, ex-military professor at Harvard was teaching a counterinsurgency class at Harvard, and the idea was going to be helping students apply military counterinsurgency techniques to black neighborhoods in Massachusetts. And
I do not remember that. Are you serious?
yeah, and a bunch of students started asking these questions about it, and Harvard canceled the class. But there's these very rare moments when people like that ex-military Harvard professor, they didn't understand that what Kamala Harris and Biden and other people understand, which is that we're going to do all these things, but you can't actually tell people that it's taken from the military colonial strategy. You have to give it names like community policing. Now, all of a sudden, you can talk about it and you can do it. And you can even get Democrats who don't know what community policing is to give you hundreds of millions of dollars for it when they don't understand it as a tactic of pacification and surveillance so that you can actually not change any of the underlying inequalities.
I mean, what's frustrating is I hear you and so many others persuasively link the carceral system in the United States, the surveillance relationships, the cop cities, the over-policing, the police brutality with these systems of oppression abroad, the way that they're imported, the direct training that our cops are getting in other parts of the world like Israel. And it does seem so obvious how our fates are tied. But then I log on and I see a kind of breathless excitement, which I understand on an emotional level, about Kamala being the nominee and no longer having to kind of white knuckle it through these Joe Biden speeches that were very difficult to watch. I see her being Charlie XCX bratted and memeified and coconut tree, and everybody's coconut pilled. And there's many on the left that I think are excited to see Biden go down. Kamala seems to be a softer alternative on a number of issues. There's an argument that she's a soft alternative on Israel, although I've been pushing back against that. And that has also affected people's willingness to stand by the criticisms they made of her from the left on her criminal justice record. I'm looking at a tweet now by someone called Eva Stiles that puts Kamala as a cop in quotation marks and then goes on to say, yes, and Trump is a dictator who is itching to take every single one of your human rights away in an instant. Stop the performative activism and get it the fuck together. How are you kind of consuming this moment where there does seem to be a relitigation of whether Kamala is in fact a cop and whether or not that matters in the grand scheme of what people see as a electoral binary? I would argue that it's not, that you can vote for third parties, or that in the alternative, you could be pushing Kamala to be, not a cop before you pledge your vote to her. But how are you seeing all of this? And does it make you as frustrated as it makes me to see people bifurcating what you've just described as like a very tightly interwoven relationship between policing here, policing abroad, what's happening in Palestine, and what's happening here in the United States of America?
That's a really hard question, and I don't purport to have any kind of objective answer. I can just give you some personal opinions. I think we're all struggling in these times to know what is right. My own view that I've arrived at after many years of struggling against these systems that are enormously unfair, enormously unjust, enormously violent, and they have been, no matter which party has held the White House. The work that I do has been very similar in the United States. But I view my role as, and I think it's actually good political strategy, although I don't purport to be a successful politician, but I think you need to always and relentlessly tell the truth. I think if you tell people the truth as a rule, and if you have a very, very high bar for ever not telling people the truth, you will not only be doing justice to yourself and have integrity, but people will respect that and trust it. And I think one of the big problems in our society is that politicians almost never tell the truth. The entire job of someone like Matt Miller at the State Department or John Kirby at the White House or any press secretary is to not tell the truth. Like those entire press conferences are exercises in obfuscation. And so for me, part of telling the truth is holding people to the values that they themselves articulate, is identifying the ways in which our society is not living up to its own values, that the way we talk and the way we print beautiful things in our constitutional scrolls and in our monuments is so different from the way life is actually lived for people who don't have power in our society. And talking about that gap between our images and the images we project and what we actually do to people is so important no matter what. And so I'm going to keep doing that no matter who's in power or who's running. It's very important. Otherwise, nothing really matters. If you're not willing to tell and I think this is, again, a really important insight from George Orwell in 1984. It's absolutely vital that you're able, even in your own mind, to always remember that 2 + 2 = 4. If you start believing that 2 + 2 = 5, or you keep saying 2 + 2 = 5 all the time, you're gonna lose sense of what reality is. And so that's why I think it's so maddening that in the United States, things like body cameras are portrayed as a liberal reform. But if you go to places like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or various dictatorships, police surveillance is not, they don't have to justify police surveillance as a reform. So the same companies, the same technology, the same investors is happening in multiple places around the world, but the narrative to the public is so vastly different. So what I'm trying to do with the body camera essay is something like my answer to your question, which is I'm trying to tell people the truth, that if you care about police violence, if you care about violence generally, you need to be very careful about what politicians are telling you the solutions are, because if you start supporting the wrong solutions, you might actually be supporting things that not only distract you from the real questions, but that actually make them worse. So telling the truth means exposing the ways in which politicians like Kamala Harris are constantly peddling supposed, solutions that often are asked or sort of providing the wrong answers to the wrong questions. And for me, that is my role as someone who cares about injustice in our society.
I mean, I think what's so frustrating, and to pick up on your descriptor Orwellian, is seeing, I mean, I'm looking at an article in Politico that's literally titled, "Kamala the Cop Doesn't Sound So Bad in 2024. I saw someone else post kind of side-by-side articles, one from, the primary 2020 primary era and one from now. The primary one talks about Kamala Harris's criminal justice record and the critique she's gotten from justice advocates in California. And the contemporary one says something about how, she's not really a cop, actually. All of those claims were overblown. And seeing some of the same people make this revisionist argument is what's been so kind of jarring. Now, I can understand, even if I don't personally subscribe to an argument that says, I fully agree and continue to believe everything I felt about Kamala back in 2019, back in 2020. But I feel as though the threat to democracy is XYZ and she's the best candidate. We're going to have to defeat Trump. And so yada, 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 the same kind of like vote blue, no matter who arguments that have been made for everyone, including Joe Biden, even as he was perpetrating a genocide. But there does seem to be something else happening where people are saying or making the argument that the claims against her from the 2020 period were in fact overblown and were propaganda, that were even racist and sexist. And I do wonder how you feel about those criticisms now in retrospect. The what was it, Emily Bazelon article, or was it her sister? I always forget who wrote the article about her Laura Bazelon, apologies, to going through her record, not just in the kind of criminal justice, traditional criminal justice context, but also the failure to prosecute Steve Mnuchin for housing fraud. All of those kinds of things really did feel weighty and important at the time. Do you still feel like those were legitimate criticisms?
Absolutely, and they didn't go far enough. I mean, her record as a prosecutor is absolutely abhorrent in every way. And I've written about it as well. But I think it's really important to understand that people like Kamala Harris or Andrew Cuomo or any of these politicians, right? If they were from Alabama or Mississippi, they'd be Republicans, most likely. They are kind of empty vessels. Most of the people who succeed in our political system at this moment are not people of great moral conviction who are, doing this. I'm speaking in broad, brushstrokes here, but they are responsive to power and to bases. And so if they had a base that were clamoring for, ending abortion or, any number of other, that's who they're beholden to. That's why it, I think, is a bad political strategy to be overly enamored with any politician. What you should be doing, in my opinion, as a matter of political strategy, is figuring out what's important to you and your values, figuring out what kind of policies you want to be promoting, and then organizing around making those things, building power so that whoever is in office has to listen to that. But that's why police unions are so powerful in most cities, no matter who's the mayor, right? The police union exercises an enormous amount of control over what happens because they have actual power. They have organized people. They have money, right? So the critical thing is building a base. And if you build a base and you have integrity and you know what issues you care about, and this is another reason why, the resurgence of some of the auto worker unions is so important, right? If you build actual political bases, you're then in a position to demand from whoever's in power the things that you want. And so I think what makes Kamala different in these different eras is that she is responding to different bases at different times. So the reason she started talking more about progressive reform in 2020 is her perceived Democratic Party base had moved to the left. So Kamala moved to the left, right? That's really different. She ran to the right, from the right, as a prosecutor in San Francisco years prior, because she understood that that's what so politicians are, and I don't mean this even as a criticism of them, if they want to be successful politicians, they have to respond to a base. And so,
well, I think if anything, it's sounding like a criticism of the base. I mean, I hear you not necessarily wanting to draw that line, but I'll say it. I mean, my frustration is that to the extent that you believe that Kamala is more influenceable than Biden, that she has fewer of these ideological commitments to, say, being tough on crime or tough on Palestine or whatever it is, if you think that's the case, which, again, I have some skepticism about, then that is an argument for pushing her, not saying, oh, I'm a brat now and putting a green filter on your profile, right? And I think your point, I know to me, it feels redundant to go back over this again because 2020 is still very fresh in my mind, but I appreciate that there are younger people in the audience and people who weren't, paying as much attention during the primaries back then who would really benefit from revisiting some of the pieces that were written. I wrote a couple of pieces about whether or not there is a such thing as a progressive prosecutor at all and what her career trajectory means about her actual values, especially given how she was brought up and who her parents were and all of those kinds of things. Lee Fong wrote a piece that detailed what you've described as her running to the right of San Francisco DA Tom Hannalan. And he went to the library archives in San Francisco and found the flyers that she distributed for her first race that are straight out of a kind of a right-wing playbook. One I'm looking at right now has the torso of a man, a tan-ish man with a gun and gang signs and a tattoo that says "Enough is enough. Murder is up 30%. Skyrocketing rates of youth in jail. Another generation lost to gang violence. Who hears the cry for help? A new voice for justice." And one of them has a chalk outline on concrete saying an outline for disaster. Which district attorney has ranked last in convictions every year for the last 8 years, trying to hit her opponent on not locking enough people up. I mean, this is who she is, or at least this is who she was when she was responsive to a certain kind of base. So if you want her to not be this kind of person, my argument would be to not be this kind of base and not pledge fealty to her without forcing her to have a real reckoning with her record.
Yeah, I just think that's what politics, like, what matters is building power, and the politicians respond to who has power. And so the reason that I personally, focus so much on trying to clear away a lot of the deception and propaganda, and the reason I wrote the propaganda book, which will be out, in a few months, is to try to strip away a lot of the distraction for people and focus on what really matters, which is like what's actually happening to human beings in our world, what's actually happening to our natural environment, what's actually happening. Once you have a grasp on that, then you can see who else cares about this? How do we come together to organize around it? And then if you build enough power with enough people in your local community, in your region, in your country, then the people who want to be in power are going to have to listen to that. And that is so much more important than any one election. And so, I think there are obviously, dire consequences at particular moments in electoral history, and deciding to vote for one person over another person, is fine. People should do whatever, but the real work, the deep work, the long-term work is all about organizing and deep political education so that you can fortify your own mind against the relentless propaganda that is being fed to us by people who own a lot of stuff in our society. And so I think that to me is the North Star. And that leads me to think that it's always going to be important to, with kindness and love and joy and sometimes humor, to speak the truth. And as I see it, and other people should speak the truth as they see it. But the moment we start to lie to ourselves, and I think part of some people's truth could be, yes, Kamala Harris has done horrific things and has seemed to vacillate between wildly different positions based on her own assessment of what's good for her political career. But that means that if we organize enough and build enough power, we can influence her to do things differently. And maybe that could be some person's truth. That is not, and I think there's so much simplistic conversation online that, like, telling the truth and being critical of Kamala is not supporting Donald Trump. It's not supporting right-wing fascist movement. It's actually helping our whole society have a clearer and more appropriate discussion about the massive threats and harms we face to all of our survival.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I appreciate you coming to talk to me today, because I got to tell you, some of this, it feels sort of like, to use an overused term, gaslighting, to see people saying Kamala is not a cop. Actually, like, the revisionist history is really fascinating to watch, because it really hasn't been that many years. And it feels different than what we were experiencing with Biden, where people were, at least in the left, I'm talking about. I don't expect very much from centrists, but at least on the left, people were, willing to argue, sure, I don't want the genocide, but I have to vote for him to stop Trump. There's like an honesty in that. I don't personally agree with it. I don't personally respect it, but there's a kind of an honesty in that, where I feel like because Kamala's record is not as clear as what we're seeing coming out of Palestine, which is so undeniable, that there's a little sophistry going on. And so I appreciate you coming on and kind of laying the foundation for what she has been, who she has been in the past, and also talking about this broader story of body cams, the more pervasive narratives that are being used by politicians across the political aisle to keep us in a cycle of reform instead of actually transforming our society in the way that it needs to be transformed. Alec, where can people find you and your work on the internet and beyond?
Our organization is called Civil Rights Corps, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that has nothing to do with any political conversation at all. And that organization is an amazing group that has, we bring civil rights cases on behalf of the most powerless people in our society and work with them in their communities to build power. We've helped get hundreds of thousands of people out of jail and do really amazing work with our team. So you can check out our work at Civ Rights Corps on social media, or civilrightscorps.org. And you can read my first book, Usual Cruelty, which is all about how the system actually works and contains I think, a short, clear critique of the progressive prosecutor concept as well. And then my book Propaganda is coming out soon in a few months, so you can read that there, or my newsletter on Substack is Alec's Propaganda Newsletter.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining. Thanks to all of you listeners for tuning in this week. You can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. I appreciate you being here as a part of this community as things get weird in American politics. As always, take care of yourselves and remember to keep the faith.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.